My father was somewhat a skeptic in the paranormal. However, one of the few stories my dad would share about his childhood scarred him to this day. He was born in Cambodia, and around age 14 is when he experienced what war was like. The Khmer Rouge, as described by my grandmother and parents, were ruthless. Often, families get separated, and because of that, my father's parents knew they had to get my father far from what was going to happen. One night, as they were rudely awakened by Khmer Rouge trying to get in the house, my father could hear his parents constantly shouting at him to run so that he wouldn't have to see what was going to happen if he stuck around longer. My dad told me this was the hardest thing he ever had to do in his life, but he did. He ran from the thickest forest of Cambodia to make his way to Thailand. At the halfway mark between Cambodia and Thailand, a few monks spotted my dad and asked him where he was heading by himself at this time of night. My dad, who understood Thai, told them about his situation, so they decided to walk with my dad where they would take him in. As you can imagine, the forest is pretty thick and the sound of gunfire echoed throughout. The monks would casually stop at times to pray because dead bodies would be found, and my father was terrified by the sight of it, like any kid would be. As moments seemed like forever, my father heard a faint female voice in this pitch-black forest. He looked up at the monks and noticed they started to chant and pray because they heard it too. My father, terrified, decided to stand in between the monks. This is what my father had a hard time explaining to us. As the monks chanted and prayed, they noticed there was movement coming above them. The trees started to shake, and my father told me he saw what he believed was a lady with long hair. The monks decided to continue chanting and told my dad to not look or pay attention to her. As they started chanting louder, the trees around them started to shake violently. At this moment, the monks told my dad to make a run for it because the border of Thailand was just up ahead. As he was running the entire time, he said that something was chasing him. He felt like something was nearly at his back but was far out of reach. He numbed out the pain from his feet and continued running. Whilst it felt like an eternity, he spotted some sunlight and pushed through the last few steps out of the forest. Whatever that was chasing him stopped, and my father decided to turn around. He spotted the monks coming out, and he said they looked as if they had fought someone, or something. My dad asked the two monks if they saw what he saw. They said yes, and they thought having him run ahead would keep whatever it was away. But they said once my dad took off running, that thing was chasing him, the entire time. I know that it seems so cliched to start by saying, I don't believe in ghosts, but... However, that's where I'm coming from. A few years ago, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Huaiyin, China. It was my first time living on my own. The apartment block had been built in the 1930s. I'd been there for a few months when I came home from work one day and went into the bathroom. I saw something strange. The wooden board covering a hole in the ceiling that led to a small attic space lay broken in two pieces on the ground. I examined the broken pieces. The board was an inch thick, and it would have taken a Bruce Lee to break it. I thought the landlord had sent someone to work on the attic. I was frozen stiff with fear. I thought someone is up there for sure. I emailed pictures to the landlord asking if anyone had been there, with an undertone of annoyance since she hadn't warned me. Her reply read, "Please call me as soon as you are able to." I called, and she explained that her last two tenants had said the same thing happened. She promised to replace the board, and she did. A month later, I woke up one night around 4 a.m. I had so many goosebumps, it felt like someone was rubbing his or her hands on me. Everything was silent, but then I heard this sound coming from above my bed. It was a dragging sound, like someone pulling a sack of potatoes. I was frozen stiff with fear. I thought someone is up there for sure. There is no way an animal could make that sound. After 5 minutes, I managed to work up the courage to turn on the light and walk to the bathroom. I was armed with a cricket bat. When I looked, I saw that the new board covering the hole was broken in two. I felt sick. The dragging sound had stopped, but I heard something else, whispering. The sound was clear and coming from the attic. It sounded like children's voices, and I could hear one sentence repeated over and over. "It's your turn. It's your turn." I switched on every light in the apartment to make things feel normal. It was 5 a.m. and dark outside. I watched TV to try to unwind. Then a fuse blew. My pet cat Dexter, whom I kept in the kitchen, usually never made a sound at night, but he started squawking like he was being strangled. I'd never heard him make those sorts of noises. He was screaming. That's when I looked up and saw hands reach out from the ceiling. I grabbed my car keys, ran out, sat in my car, and waited there until the sun came up. When I saw people walking their dogs, this comforted me enough to go back in. The front door was open, but I thought I hadn't closed it when I'd run out. I went to the kitchen to check on Dexter, and he wasn't in his cage. I felt sick again. All my windows were closed, so I looked everywhere inside. When I walked to the bathroom, I heard splashing. Dexter was half drowned in the toilet. I took him out, washed him, and dried him. I was so confused. At 8 a.m., I called the landlord and gave her a watered-down version of the night. "Oh, wow. You heard the whispering too," she said. I stayed in that apartment for another 18 months. I heard the whispering on a few occasions, and twice the board covering the hole in the ceiling moved. Although I live elsewhere, the landlord recently called. She said that her new tenants had begged to speak with me about some of the stuff that's been going on there. "Forget it," I said. "It's their problem now." My dad had to go on a business trip to China, so he decided to make it a family vacation and take me, a teenage girl, and my older brother along with him. However, my dad had to work the whole time, so we only really saw him in the evenings when he came back to the hotel to eat dinner with us. To make sure my brother and I still had a good time and weren't bored being alone, my dad organized a tour guide to take us around the city. The tour was organized by the hotel we were staying at, and the rest of the people in the group were other Americans. Overall, we felt pretty comfortable and safe about the whole thing, and were fine exploring the city practically on our own. When the day started, we first visited a local market. Now, when I say it was crowded, I mean crowded. I had to hold on to my brother's jacket or hand most of the time to make sure I didn't lose him. The market was filled with locals doing their daily shopping and whatnot, so naturally we stood out like a sore thumb. To make things worse, we didn't speak Chinese, and almost nobody there spoke English, so it was easy to feel out of place. It didn't matter too much to me, though, and I continued browsing the shops and taking pictures on my phone. I also took a bunch of selfies, which will be important later. We got to one shop where you could buy tea leaves and fancy cups, and I started looking around in one side of the store while my brother went to the other. While I was browsing, a few men, maybe in their late 20s, appeared behind me and started to make polite conversation. Now I've been told about stranger danger about 1,000,000 times, so I ignored them. They started asking questions about where I was from and how old I was. One man even offered to buy me the teacup I was looking at, but I remained silent and walked back to my brother. After it became clear that I wasn't alone, and I wasn't going to say anything either, the men said something to each other in Chinese and walked away. I didn't think too much of it then, and the day continued. Throughout the day, we visited a bunch more tourist spots, a silk factory, some monuments, etc., and I kept taking pictures and videos. In the evening, we came to our last destination, Tiananmen Square. It was packed, and I was scared I would get lost in the crowds, so naturally I stuck close by my brother again. As we walked through the plaza, we came to a wide open plot that was a bit more secluded from the main entrance. The tour guide told us we could wander around a bit and meet back in the same spot in around 15 minutes. As my brother and I started walking around, an older man approached my brother. He was very well dressed, not in a suit, but had on fancier clothes than a normal tourist would wear. He started asking my brother questions about directions to another monument that was close by, which I found extremely odd. Clearly we were tourists and not from the area, so why was he asking us for directions? The man started walking slowly in the opposite direction of where I was, and my brother unknowingly started walking alongside him while trying to give him directions. Being a normal, restless kid, I started walking around and taking selfies. As I lifted my phone up, I froze. The men who had tried to talk to me in the tea shop almost 10 hours earlier were there, and watching me. They tried to be nonchalant about it, but at that point I was hyper-aware that they were watching me and talking to each other about me. It was also extremely clear that they were taking pictures of me under the guise of taking pictures of the monument, so I tried to kind of cover my face and look down. They were also extremely close, and at this point my brother was not close by me anymore. Without thinking any longer, I quickly screamed, not in a shriek, but more like a kid throwing a tantrum kind of way. This caught my brother's attention, who quickly turned to look at me. I jogged up to him and played up the whole tantrum, saying that my feet hurt and we needed to go sit down back where we came from. I could tell he was irritated by my behavior, but he agreed, and I quickly pulled him away back to our tour guide. When we were safely surrounded by our tour guide and tour members, I turned to my brother and told him, in our not commonly spoken native language, that I was pretty sure I was being followed. Even though my brother didn't see the men, it was like something clicked for him. He walked behind me with his hands on my shoulders for the remainder of the tour and told me that he had texted our dad about what was happening. I never saw the men again, and we soon went back to the hotel. Later, when I was going through my photos and videos, I almost had a heart attack. The men that I met in the tea shop were in the background of nearly every single one. They were quite far away, and almost never looking directly at me. But they were there, the whole day. I don't know what would have happened if they had gotten my brother far enough away from me, or if I hadn't noticed them. My mind has run through the possibilities, and every single one gives me nightmares. What creeps me out the most is knowing with almost complete certainty that they have pictures of me, and I don't know what they did with them. I grew up in a small village in China, surrounded by lush greenery and steep mountain ranges. The village was known for its peaceful atmosphere and its friendly inhabitants, but there was always an underlying sense of unease that permeated the air. As a child, I would often hear whispers about the supernatural creatures that roamed the forests and mountains, and as just a naive kid, my curiosity was strong. One day when I was around 14 years old, overwhelmed with boredness having been living in a small village, I decided to venture into the woods alone. It was still light outside, but the sun was setting. As I wandered deeper into the forest, I began to hear a strange noise. It was a low, guttural growling sound, and it seemed to be coming from all around me. I was not afraid, however, having believed it to be just the growling of some local foxes, who at this point had not attacked any residents. As I continued on, the growling grew louder, and I began to feel a sense of dread wash over me. The growling sounded harsh, not like any fox I had ever heard. Suddenly, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. It was a shadowy figure, lurking in the darkness of the trees. I couldn't make out what it was, but I knew that it was not a fox, nor human. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy and uncooperative. The growling was getting closer, and I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. I turned around and saw the creature for the first time. I remember it clearly, the creature having traumatized me so greatly as a child. Its eyes were large, very large, but they were out of their socket, staring at me. It as well had an incredibly long tongue, reaching clearly past his chin, and its clothes seemed tattered and torn. I was frozen with fear, unable to move as the creature bore down on me. Just as it was about to strike, I heard a voice calling out my name. It was my mother, and she was frantically searching for me. The creature vanished into thin air, and I was left trembling with fear. I never spoke of the incident to anyone. I don't know why, but I was a kid, and I was scared if I had, it would appear again. I would see it in my nightmares, stalking me through the forest and always on the verge of catching me. I couldn't get good sleep for the next 3 years. Now I'm 29, and I suddenly remembered that incident when I went to visit my grandparents back at the village. So I decided to research what it was that I saw, and I came upon the conclusion that it was a Diao Sigui. I don't know if I was lucky to survive that encounter, or if even my imagination was playing a trick on me. Either way, I don't think I will ever forget what happened. And yes, I am still traumatized by forests. It was a dark and stormy night when the Smith family moved into their new home. The house was beautiful, with its high ceilings, grand staircase, and elegant architecture, But little did they know they had just moved into a house that was already occupied. At first, the family thought the strange occurrences were just their imagination. They would hear creaks and moans, but they would just chalk it up to the age of the house. But as time went on, the events became more frequent and more violent. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut, and strange noises could be heard throughout the house. But the family refused to believe that they were living with a poltergeist. One night, things took a turn for the worse. The family was sitting in the living room watching TV when the lights flickered and went out. They heard footsteps coming from the hallway, but when they turned on their flashlights, there was no one there. Suddenly, a vase flew across the room and shattered against the wall. The family was terrified and didn't know what to do. They tried to leave the house, but the doors were locked from the outside. The family was trapped inside with the poltergeist. The entity had taken over their home and was determined to make their lives a living hell. The family decided to seek help from a psychic. The psychic confirmed that the house was indeed haunted by a poltergeist, and that it was a malevolent spirit that had been wronged in life. The spirit was angry and wanted revenge, and it had targeted the family as its new victims. The psychic warned the family that they needed to leave the house immediately, but the family refused to abandon their home. They had invested too much time and money into it, and they didn't want to give up without a fight. As the days went on, the poltergeist became even more aggressive. It would slam doors shut, break dishes, and even throw furniture around the room. The family was at limit. One night, the poltergeist reached its breaking point. It unleashed its full fury on the family, throwing objects at them with such force that they were lucky to escape with their lives. The family knew that they had to do something to stop the poltergeist. They turned to a priest, who performed an exorcism on the house. The exorcism was intense, and the family could hear the poltergeist screaming in agony as the priest battled it. Finally, the poltergeist was banished from the house, and the family was finally able to live in peace. But the memory of the poltergeist's reign of terror stayed with them forever. They knew that they had come dangerously close to losing their lives, and they vowed to never underestimate the power of the paranormal again. The family had learned the hard way that some things are beyond their understanding, and that there are forces in the world that they cannot control. They had also learned that sometimes the best thing to do is to seek help from someone who knows how to deal with the supernatural. The poltergeist had taught the family a valuable lesson, but it was a lesson that they would never forget. They had survived a brush with the paranormal, and they knew that they were lucky to have made it out alive. From that day on, they lived their lives with a newfound respect for the unknown, always aware that there are things in this world that are beyond our understanding. I had been looking forward to my vacation for months. I had found a great Airbnb in the countryside, perfect for a relaxing getaway. But as soon as I arrived at the property, I knew something was off. The house was old and creaky, with peeling paint and broken windows. As I entered, a shiver ran down my spine. It felt like I was being watched. Ignoring my unease, I started to unpack my things, but as I was putting my clothes away, I heard a faint whisper coming from the corner of the room. I froze, not sure if I'd really heard anything, but then the whisper came again, louder this time. I turned around, but no one was there. That's when I noticed the strange symbol etched into the wall, an intricate design that looked like it had been made with a knife. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, as I realized that this Airbnb was not what it seemed. I tried to brush off my unease, but as the night wore on, strange things began to happen. I would hear footsteps in the hallway, even though I was the only one staying in the house. I would find objects moved from where I had left them, and sometimes the door would open by itself. But the scariest thing was the tall, lanky man that I would sometimes see out of the corner of my eye. He was always in the shadows, lurking just out of sight. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel his presence, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. One night, as I was lying in bed, I felt a hand grab my ankle. I screamed and kicked, but no one was there. I turned on the lights, but the room was empty. That's when I knew that I had to leave. Growing up, I always heard stories about the old abandoned school on the edge of town. It was said to be haunted by the spirits of students who had died in a tragic fire decades ago. As a teenager, I was naturally curious, and I often found myself drawn to the school. I would wander around the deserted halls, feeling a strange sense of unease, but never actually seeing anything supernatural. That all changed one night when I decided to explore the school with a group of friends. We had heard rumours that there was a hidden room somewhere in the building, and we were determined to find it. We crept through the dark, musty corridors, using our flashlights to guide us. The school was eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we reached the end of the hallway, we came across a locked door. It looked old and rusted, but we could tell that it had been recently oiled. This was it, the hidden room we had been looking for. We tried the door, and to our surprise, it opened easily. We stepped inside, and immediately felt a wave of cold air wash over us. The room was pitch black, and the only sound was the faint dripping of water from somewhere in the distance. We searched for a light switch, but couldn't find one, so we relied on our flashlights to illuminate the room. That's when we saw her. Standing in the far corner of the room was a young girl, no older than 10 years old. She was wearing a tattered school uniform, and her long dark hair hung in tangled knots around her face. At first we thought she was just another student exploring the school like we were, but as we approached her, we realized that something was terribly wrong. The girl's eyes were empty, and her skin was grey and lifeless. She was staring straight ahead, not reacting to our presence at all. We called out to her, but she didn't respond. We moved closer, shining our flashlights in her face, but she still didn't move. It was then that we noticed the fire burns on her clothes and skin. The same burns that had killed the students who had perished in the fire all those years ago. We tried to leave the room, but the door wouldn't budge. We were trapped, alone with the ghostly figure of the little girl. As we turned back towards her, we saw her eyes light up with an otherworldly glow. Her mouth opened, and a chilling voice echoed through the room. "Why did you leave me here?" she asked. "Why did you abandon me?" We were frozen in terror, unable to move or speak. We had never experienced anything like this before. Suddenly the lights flickered on and the girl disappeared. We were alone in the room once more. We stumbled out of the room, shaken and terrified. As we made our way down the hall, we heard strange noises behind us. It sounded like footsteps, but there was no one there. We finally made it out of the school, but the memory of that night still haunts me to this day. I can't explain what we saw or heard, but I know that it was real. To this day, I still wonder what happened to that little girl and why she was trapped in that room. But one thing is for sure, I will never forget the horror of that night in the abandoned school. Sophie was a student in her second year of college, living in a small apartment with her best friend. One night, she was alone in the apartment, studying for an upcoming exam. It was late, and the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing by outside. As she sat at her desk, she heard a faint scratching noise coming from the living room. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the sound of the building settling, but the scratching grew louder. Sophie walked to the living room, and as she entered, she saw a shadowy figure dart behind the couch. Her heart began to race as she realized that she was not alone in the apartment. She called out to her friend, hoping that she had come home early, but there was no answer. Sophie searched the apartment, but she found no one. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Sophie would come home to find her belongings moved around, or the furniture rearranged. She heard footsteps in the hallway at night, and whispers in the dark. Sophie's friend dismissed her concerns, thinking that she was just stressed from school. But Sophie knew that there was something in the apartment with her, something malevolent and dangerous. One night, Sophie woke up to find a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was tall and thin, with glowing eyes and sharp claws. Sophie screamed, but the figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Sophie's friend didn't believe her story, thinking that she had just had a nightmare. But Sophie knew that what she had seen was real. One night, Sophie woke up to find the dark figure standing at the foot of her bed again. But this time, It didn't disappear. It began to move towards her, slowly at first, then picking up speed. Sophie felt a cold hand on her arm, and she knew that she was in grave danger. She screamed for her friend, but the figure covered her mouth with its hand, silencing her. Sophie's friend burst into the room and the figure vanished. But the damage had been done. Sophie was shaken and traumatized by the experience. She moved out of the apartment soon after, never looking back. But the memory of that night stayed with her, haunting her dreams and reminding her of the darkness that lurks in the world. Once upon a time, in a small town in the middle of nowhere, a group of friends decided to play with an Ouija board for fun. They had heard stories about the board's ability to communicate with spirits, but they didn't take it seriously. They believed it was just a game and nothing bad could happen to them. The group gathered around the board, their fingers resting lightly on the planchette. They asked the board if anyone was there, and to their surprise it moved towards yes. They were thrilled and thought it was just their imagination. They continued to ask the board questions, and it continued to answer them with accuracy. The group started to feel uneasy, but they couldn't stop playing. As the game went on, the atmosphere around them changed. The room became colder, and they could hear strange noises that made them jump. Suddenly the planchette started moving on its own, and the group's fingers were dragged along with it. They were no longer in control, and the board began spelling out ominous messages. The group panicked and tried to stop playing, but the board wouldn't let them. The messages it spelled out became more and more terrifying, and the group felt like they were trapped in a nightmare. They were surrounded by an eerie silence, and the only sounds were the boards creaking and their own fearful breathing. The group's faces grew pale, and they were trembling with fear. They realized that they had unleashed something sinister and couldn't put it back in its box. They begged the board to stop, but the messages continued. Suddenly the planchette started to move faster, and the group could hear whispers that they couldn't understand. They felt like they were being watched by an invisible presence, and the room became suffocating. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the board stopped. The group felt relieved but exhausted. They had experienced something they couldn't explain, and knew they would never forget it. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, the room suddenly became pitch black, and they heard a voice that made their blood run cold. The voice said, "You're not leaving yet. I have one more thing to show you." The group was paralyzed with fear, and they couldn't move. Suddenly the room lit up with an eerie green light, and they saw a figure in the corner of the room. It was a young girl, with long black hair, dressed in a white dress. She was staring at them with empty, lifeless eyes. The group screamed in terror and ran towards the door, but it wouldn't open. They were trapped, and the girl continued to stare at them with an expressionless face. The group knew they had to get out of there, and they frantically tried to find a way out. Finally, one of them managed to break a window and they all escaped, running as fast as they could. After that night, the group never spoke about what had happened. They had all experienced something so terrifying that it had left a mark on them forever. They knew they had played with something they shouldn't have, and they regretted it. They learned that some things should remain a mystery, and that some doors should never be opened. I had always been fascinated by abandoned buildings, so when I heard about an old dilapidated hospital on the outskirts of town, I knew I had to explore it. I grabbed my camera and set off, eager to capture the eerie beauty of the decaying building. As soon as I stepped inside, I knew that something was off. The air was heavy and still, and there was a faint smell of decay that hung in the air. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floors creaked under my feet. I was in the middle of taking a picture of a rusted surgical table when I heard it. A faint whispering sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the building. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering grew louder and I could make out snippets of words and phrases. It was as if there were dozens of voices all talking at once. I started to feel like I was suffocating, like the walls of the hospital were closing in on me. As they explored the factory, they found nothing of interest. The old machinery had been removed, and there was nothing left inside but rusted metal and crumbling concrete. But then, they stumbled upon a hidden staircase leading down into the bowels of the factory. It was a staircase that looked like it had not been used in decades, and the group hesitated before descending into the darkness. The staircase seemed to go on forever, each step taking them deeper into the belly of the factory. The air grew colder and the darkness more oppressive, and the group began to feel a sense of unease. And watching me. They tried to be nonchalant about it, but at that point I was hyper-aware that they were watching me and talking to each other about me. It was also extremely The man shouted at the ghosts, and they recoiled in fear. He grabbed me by the hand and pulled me to my feet, and we ran towards the safety of the outside world. As we emerged from the forest, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I turned to thank the man who had saved my life, but he was gone. I looked around, but there was no sign of him. I was alone, but I was safe. As I made my way back to civilization, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that still lingered within me. The ghostly figures, their haunted whispers, and the deep, dark forest haunted my thoughts. I knew that I had experienced something otherworldly and terrifying, and I couldn't explain it. Planchette started to move faster, and the group could hear whispers that they could. I also discovered that there had been several incidents of paranormal activity reported in the hospital over the years. People had heard screams and whispers, seen apparitions, and felt a sense of overwhelming dread. I knew then that the spirits that haunted the hospital were trapped there, unable to find peace. They were angry and confused, seeking revenge for the horrors that they had endured. I decided to go back to the hospital, armed with the knowledge that I had gained. I hoped that I could find a way to help the spirits move on. As soon as I stepped inside, I could feel their presence. The air was thick with their energy, and I could hear whispers and screams coming from every corner. I walked through the halls, calling out to the spirits, telling them that I wanted to help. And then I heard a voice, clear and distinct, calling my name. I followed the sound, and it led me to a small room on the second floor. Inside, I found a young woman dressed in a white hospital gown. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with sadness. She told me her name was Emily, and that she had been a patient in the hospital for many years. She had been subjected to cruel treatments, and had eventually died within the walls of the hospital. I listened to her story, tears streaming down my face. And then I promised her that I would do everything in my power to help her find peace. Over the next few weeks, I worked tirelessly to cleanse the hospital of the negative energy that had been trapping the spirits there. I burned sage, played soothing music, and meditated, calling out to the spirits and urging them to move on. And slowly, but surely, it worked. The whispers and screams faded away, and the air in the hospital became lighter and more peaceful. I never saw Emily or any of the other spirits again, but I knew that they had finally found the peace that they had been searching for. As I left the hospital for the final time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. I had come to know the spirits that haunted the building, and they had become a part of me. But I also knew that I had done what I could to help them, and that they were finally at rest. And that gave me a sense of closure, a sense that I had truly made a difference in the world, no matter how small. I remember the day I decided to venture into the abandoned amusement park. It was a decision I would come to regret for the rest of my life. The park had been closed for years, the rides rusted and creaking in the wind. The once vibrant colours now faded and peeling. Despite the warnings from my friends, I was determined to explore the park, to see what secrets lay hidden within. As I made my way through the park, the air felt thick and heavy. The silence was deafening, the only sound coming from the rustling leaves and the occasional creaking of the rides. It was as if time had stood still in this place. As I walked past the carousel, I heard a faint melody playing. It was eerie and haunting, and it sent chills down my spine. I couldn't quite place the tune, but it was familiar somehow. I followed the sound, my curiosity getting the best of me. As I turned the corner, I saw her. A little girl, dressed in a white dress, her hair in pigtails. She was sitting on the edge of the carousel, her feet dangling. She seemed so real, so solid, that for a moment I thought she was alive. "Hey there," I called out to her. "What are you doing here all by yourself?" She turned to me and her face was blank, expressionless. Her eyes were vacant, and I realized with a start that she wasn't real at all. She was a ghost. I took a step back, my heart racing. I wanted to run, to get as far away from the park as possible, but something held me there. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe it was something more sinister. And then they heard it. A sound like grinding metal coming from deep within the factory. It was a sound that made their skin crawl, a sound that seemed to be alive with a malevolent energy. The group hesitated, but curiosity got the better of them, and they continued down the staircase. As they descended, the sound grew louder and more insistent, until it was almost unbearable. Finally, they reached the bottom of the staircase, and they found themselves in a vast underground chamber. The air was thick with dust, and the sound of metal grinding against metal filled their ears. But there was always an underlying sense of unease that permeated the air. As a child, I would often hear whispers about the supernatural creatures that roamed the forests and mountains. And as just a naive kid, my curiosity was strong. And then, they saw it. A figure shrouded in darkness appeared in the distance, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. It was a being of darkness, a creature that seemed to be made of shadows and smoke. The group tried to run, but the creature was too fast. It moved with an otherworldly grace, its long limbs propelling it forward with incredible speed. One by one, the friends fell, consumed by the darkness that surrounded them. The creature seemed invincible, unstoppable, as if it were immune to any harm that they could inflict. Dread washed over me. The growling sounded harsh, not like any fox I had ever heard. Suddenly, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. It was a shadowy figure, lurking in the darkness of the trees. I couldn't make out what it was, but I knew that it was not a fox, nor human. I tried to run, but my legs felt... But this time, she wasn't alone. She was surrounded by a group of ghosts, all staring at me with their lifeless eyes. I wanted to run, to get as far away from the park as possible, but I was frozen to the spot. The ghosts closed in on me, their icy breath on my skin once again. I felt like I was suffocating, like they were trying to pull me into their world, to make me one of them. And then I heard a voice, faint and distant, but somehow familiar. "Come back to us," it whispered. "Join us." I shook my head, trying to clear my mind. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare, a figment of my imagination. But the ghosts were real, and they were getting closer. I could feel their cold fingers on my skin, and I knew I had to do something, anything to escape. With all my strength, I broke free from their grasp and ran as fast as I could. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was outside the park, my heart pounding in my chest. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. It had been so real, so terrifying. I knew now that the ghosts were real, that they were still there, waiting for their next victim. I never went back to the park again, and I never forgot what I had seen. The ghosts haunted my dreams for years, their lifeless eyes and icy breath a constant reminder of what I had experienced. And then one day, I received a letter in the mail. It was from the park, inviting me to come back and see the renovations they had done. They promised a new, exciting experience, one that would leave me breathless. I hesitated for a moment, my memories of the park still fresh in my mind. But then I remembered the ghosts, the way they had tried to pull me into their world. I knew I had to go back, to face my fears once and for all, so I went back to the park. But this time, it was different. The rides were new, the colours vibrant and alive. There were children laughing and screaming, their faces alight with joy. And then I saw her, the little girl in the white dress sitting on the carousel. But this time she wasn't a ghost. She was real, alive, and she smiled at me as I walked by. It was then that I realized that the ghosts had been trying to warn me, to keep me safe. They had been trying to protect me from the darkness that had once inhabited the park. I smiled back at the little girl, and then I walked away, leaving the ghosts behind. They had done their job, and now it was time for me to move on. But as I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder, what if the ghosts weren't just a figment of my imagination? What if they were still there, waiting for their next victim? What if the darkness had only been hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike? I didn't have the answers, and I knew that I probably never would. But one thing was for sure. I would never forget the abandoned amusement park and the ghost that had haunted it for so many years. Asuka had always been fascinated by abandoned places, so when she heard about an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of Tokyo, she couldn't resist the urge to explore it. She gathered her camera and flashlight and set out on the long walk to the hospital. When she arrived, she found the hospital dark and foreboding. The windows were boarded up, and the weeds had grown up around the entrance. Asuka felt a shiver run down her spine as she pushed open the door. Inside, the hospital was silent and still. The only sound was the creak of Asuka's footsteps on the floorboards. She walked through the empty halls, snapping photos and admiring the eerie beauty of the place. As she turned a corner, she heard a sound behind her. She spun around but saw nothing. She shrugged it off and continued exploring, but the feeling of being watched stayed with her. Asuka made her way to the second floor, where she found a locked door. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. As she turned to leave, she heard a soft whisper. It was a woman's voice, but Asuka couldn't make out what she was saying. Asuka was too scared to stay any longer and decided to leave the hospital. But as she turned to go, she heard the whisper again. This time it was louder and more urgent. Asuka couldn't resist the pull of the voice, and she found herself drawn back to the locked door. She tried the handle again, and this time it opened with a click. As she stepped inside, Asuka felt a cold breeze blow past her. The room was empty, except for a single chair in the center. She had a mournful expression on her face, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. I tried to run, but she floated towards me, her ghostly hands reaching out to me. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew that I was in grave danger. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The ghostly figure spoke to me in a whispery voice, telling me of her tragic past and how she had died in the forest many years ago. Her story was haunting and sad, and I felt a deep sense of sorrow for her. But at the same time, I knew that I had to get away from her, or I would suffer the same fate. I stumbled backwards, tripping over a fallen branch, and suddenly I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I screamed in terror. I turned to see another ghostly figure standing behind me, this one a man, with a twisted, sinister expression on his face. He reached out to me with his ghostly hands, and I knew that he meant me harm. I tried to crawl away, but my limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. I knew that I was going to die, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The ghosts closed in on me, their ghostly hands reaching out to grab me. Just when I thought that all was lost, I heard the sound of foot as the last of the friends fell, consumed by the darkness. The creature disappeared back into the shadows. The factory fell silent once more, the only sound the sound of metal creaking in the wind. Days later, the police were called to investigate the disappearance of the... The night was dark and the rain was coming down in sheets. Jenna was driving home from a long day at work when her car suddenly sputtered and came to a stop on the side of a deserted road. She tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. Her car was dead. Jenna looked around, but there was no sign of civilization. She was in the middle of nowhere with no cell phone reception and no way to call for help. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized she was completely stranded. As the rain beat down on her car, Jenna started to panic. She had heard stories of people being stranded on deserted roads like this one and never being found again. She didn't want to be one of those people. Suddenly, Jenna heard a tapping on her window. She turned to see a man standing outside in the rain. He was tall, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. He motioned for her to roll down the window. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice deep and smooth. Jenna was hesitant. She didn't know this man, and she didn't want to put herself in danger, but she also knew she needed help, and there was no one else around. "Yes, please," she said, rolling down the window a crack. The man introduced himself as Alex and said he would help her push the car to a nearby garage where he knew the owner. Jenna was grateful for his help and climbed out of the car to assist him. As they pushed the car down the road, Jenna couldn't help but feel uneasy around Alex. There was something off about him, something that made her skin crawl, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. Finally, they reached the garage and the owner was able to fix Jenna's car. She thanked Alex and the owner and got back in her car, ready to be on her way home. But as she pulled away from the garage, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She couldn't put her finger on what it was, but she knew she was being watched. Suddenly, she heard a loud bang coming from under her car. The car jolted and sputtered, then came to a stop once again. Jenna was stranded on the side of the road once more. As she sat in her car, trying to figure out what to do next, she saw Alex walking down the road towards her. He approached her car and knocked on the window. "Need some more help?" he asked. Jenna was hesitant, but she didn't have any other options. She rolled down the window and asked for his assistance once more. Alex offered to give her a ride home since her car was clearly not going anywhere. Jenna was hesitant, but she knew she needed to get home. She reluctantly agreed. As they drove down the dark road, Jenna felt like she was being watched. She couldn't shake the feeling that Alex was up to something, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. Suddenly, Alex turned off the main road and onto a dirt path. Jenna's heart raced as she realized she had no idea where they were going. She demanded to know where they were headed, but Alex just chuckled and said it was a shortcut. Jenna's instincts were screaming at her to get out of the car, but she was too afraid to do anything. She felt like she was in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Finally, they arrived at an abandoned house deep in the woods. Alex led her inside, promising her that it was just a temporary stop until he could fix her car. Jenna knew she was in trouble. She tried to run, but Alex was too fast. He grabbed her and dragged her back inside the house, locking the door behind them. Jenna screamed for help, but there was no one around to hear her. She tried to fight Alex off, but he was much stronger than her. He pinned her down on the ground and whispered in her ear, "You're not going anywhere." Jenna's heart raced as she realized she was trapped in the house with a stranger who clearly had sinister intentions. She knew she had to think of a way to escape before it was too late. She spotted a nearby fireplace poker and reached for it, hoping to use it as a weapon. But before she could grab it, Alex snatched it away from her and threw it across the room. "You're not going to hurt me," he said, grinning menacingly. Jenna tried to reason with him, telling him she just wanted to go home. But he didn't seem interested in letting her go. He told her that he had been watching her for weeks and that he knew everything about her. Jenna's fear turned to anger. She refused to let this man control her. She lunged at him, hoping to overpower him and escape, but Alex was too quick. He grabbed her by the hair and slammed her head against the ground. Everything went black. When Jenna woke up, she was tied to a chair. Alex was standing over her, grinning. He told her that he was going to keep her there for as long as he wanted, and that there was nothing she could do about it. Jenna knew she had to escape. She struggled against the ropes, but they were too tight. She tried to scream for help, but her voice was hoarse from all the screaming she had done earlier. Days turned into weeks, and Jenna lost track of time. She was trapped in the house with no way to escape. She had no food or water, and was beginning to lose hope. But one night, Jenna heard a noise outside. She strained to listen, trying to figure out what it was. Suddenly, she heard the sound of breaking glass. Someone was trying to break into the house. Jenna's heart raced as she realized this could be her only chance to escape. She struggled against the ropes, trying to free herself. Finally, the ropes gave way and she was able to break free. She crept towards the door, trying to be as quiet as possible. She heard footsteps coming closer and closer. Jenna knew she had to act fast. She burst through the door, surprising Alex and the intruder. They were both taken aback by her sudden appearance. Jenna saw her chance and ran towards the door, hoping to escape. But Alex lunged at her, trying to grab her. She pushed him away and ran outside into the pouring rain. Jenna was free. She ran down the road as fast as she could, trying to put as much distance between herself and the house as possible. She didn't stop running until she reached a gas station. She called the police and told them everything that had happened. They were able to track down Alex and he was arrested for kidnapping and assault. Jenna never forgot her terrifying experience. She was lucky to have escaped with her life, but the memory of that dark road and the abandoned house would haunt her for years to come. I was looking forward to spending the weekend at my family's cabin in the woods. It was a place where we had made many happy memories over the years, and I couldn't wait to relax and enjoy the peace and quiet. As I arrived at the cabin, something felt off. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and the trees seemed to loom over me menacingly. But I shrugged it off, assuming that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I spent the first night alone in the cabin, reading by the fire and enjoying the solitude. But as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a strange noise outside. It was a low growl, like that of an animal, but it was too deep to be any creature I knew of. I peeked through the window, but I saw nothing. I tried to ignore the noise and go to sleep, but it kept getting louder and more persistent. Finally, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow on the trees. As I walked around the cabin, the growling grew louder and more aggressive. I was getting nervous, but I tried to convince myself that it was just a stray dog or some other harmless creature. That's when I saw it, a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I froze, unable to move as the creature emerged from the trees. It was a grotesque demon. It snarled at me, baring its teeth, and I knew that I was in trouble. I turned and ran back to the safety of the cabin, but the wolf was faster. It leapt at me, and I felt its jaws close around my leg. I screamed, but no one was around to hear me. The next thing I knew, I woke up on the floor of the cabin. My leg was throbbing with pain, and there was blood everywhere. I knew that I needed to get help, but I was miles from civilization. As I sat there trying to figure out what to do, I heard another noise outside. It was a scratching sound, like something trying to claw its way into the cabin. I crept over to the window and peered outside, but I saw nothing. That's when I heard a voice. A low, raspy voice that seemed to be coming from inside the cabin. "Let me in," it said. "I just want to talk." I froze, unsure of what to do. The voice was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was too deep and too distorted to be human. But at the same time, it seemed to be beckoning me, drawing me closer. I tried to resist, but I found myself walking towards the door. I reached for the handle, but something stopped me. It was like a force field, pushing me back and preventing me from opening the door. As I stood there, confused and terrified, the scratching outside grew louder and more persistent. I realized that there was something out there, something that wanted to hurt me. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, listening to the scratching and the growling outside. I knew that I was trapped, with no way out and no one to help me. The next morning I tried to leave, but the door was still blocked by some unseen force. I was trapped in the cabin, with whatever was outside closing in on me. As the hours ticked by, I could feel the tension building. The scratching and growling were getting louder, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before whatever was outside broke through. I was alone, helpless, and completely terrified. I knew that I had to do something, but I had no idea what. That's when I remembered the old family legend, the one about a powerful talisman that was hidden somewhere in the woods. It was said that the talisman had the power to ward off evil spirits and protect whoever possessed it. I knew that finding the talisman was my only hope. With renewed determination, I set out into the woods, limping on my injured leg. The woods were dark and foreboding, and every sound seemed to echo with menace. But I pressed on, driven by desperation and fear. I searched for hours, but I couldn't find anything. I was about to give up hope when I saw it, a glint of silver in the underbrush. I reached for it, and my fingers closed around a small, intricately carved amulet. I could feel a strange energy emanating from it, like a protective aura that surrounded me. I rushed back to the cabin, clutching the talisman tightly. When I arrived, the scratching had stopped, but I could still sense the presence of something outside, lurking in the shadows. With shaking hands, I held up the talisman and began to chant a protective spell. At first, nothing seemed to happen, but then I felt a sudden surge of power, and the cabin was filled with a blinding light. When the light faded, I found myself alone in the cabin. The scratching and growling were gone, and there was no sign of the demon or the strange voice that had haunted me. I knew that I had been saved by the talisman, and I vowed to never again underestimate the power of the supernatural. As I packed my things and prepared to leave the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. But with the talisman in my pocket, I felt confident that I could face whatever was out there. I had survived the horror of the cabin in the woods, and I was determined to never let my guard down again. It was a dark and stormy night in the small town of Millfield. The wind howled through the empty streets, rattling windows and making trees sway violently. The rain poured down in sheets, creating a constant drumming sound on the roof of the old abandoned mansion that sat on the outskirts of town. The locals whispered that the mansion was cursed, that terrible things had happened there, and that the spirits of the dead still haunted its halls. But nobody dared to go inside. Nobody wanted to disturb whatever evil lurked within. However, one stormy night, a group of teenagers, led by a boy named John, decided to explore the mansion. They had heard the stories and wanted to prove their bravery to each other. Armed with flashlights and determination, they made their way up the overgrown driveway and through the rusted gates. The mansion loomed before them, a dark silhouette against the stormy sky. The front door creaked ominously as they pushed it open, and they stepped inside. The air was musty, and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet. Cobwebs draped the furniture, and the wallpaper peeled from the walls. They made their way from room to room, searching for anything that would confirm the ghost stories they had heard. As they reached the second floor, they heard a faint whispering sound, like the rustling of leaves on a quiet night. They followed the sound to a locked door at the end of the hallway. John produced a set of lockpicks and quickly unlocked the door. Inside, they found a small room filled with cobwebs and dust. In the center of the room was an old, ornate wooden box. Without hesitation, John stepped forward and opened the box. Inside, they found an old leather-bound book. The pages were yellowed and worn, and strange symbols adorned the edges. John opened the book and began to read aloud. As he read, the air grew colder, and the storm outside grew stronger. Suddenly the room was filled with a blinding light, and a terrible scream echoed through the mansion. The teenagers stumbled backwards, shielding their eyes from the brightness. When the light faded, they found themselves alone in the room, with the book lying open on the floor. As they made their way back down the hallway, they heard a sound behind them. Turning around, they saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown with long tangled hair. Her eyes were empty, and her skin was pale as death. She reached out towards them, and they could see that her hands were covered in blood. The teenagers turned and ran, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. They stumbled down the stairs and burst through the front door, only to find that the storm had grown worse. The wind howled around them, and the rain lashed their faces. As they ran towards the safety of their homes, they could hear the woman's laughter echoing through the storm. They didn't stop until they had reached the safety of their own houses, and even then, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Days turned into weeks, and the teenagers tried to forget the horror they had experienced in the mansion. But strange things began to happen. Objects would move on their own, doors would open and close without explanation, and a feeling of unease pervaded the town. One night, John woke up to find the woman standing at the foot of his bed. Her eyes were empty, and her mouth twisted into a ghastly grin. She reached out towards him, and he could feel her cold breath on his face. He screamed and ran from the room, but he could hear her laughter following him down the hallway. The other teenagers had similar experiences, and they all knew that they had disturbed something evil in the mansion that night. They tried to warn their friends and family, but nobody believed them. They were dismissed as foolish kids, imagining things that weren't there. But the occurrences grew worse, and the town was soon consumed by a sense of dread. People began to disappear, and their bodies were found mutilated and covered in strange symbols. The locals whispered that it was the work of the spirits of the mansion, and that the teenagers had released them by opening the cursed book. John and his friends knew that they had to do something to stop the evil. They returned to the mansion, this time armed with holy water and crucifixes. They made their way up to the second floor where they had first found the book. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the walls were covered in blood. As they approached the door, they could hear the whispers again, louder this time. They pushed open the door and found themselves in a room that was completely different from the one they had seen before. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, and the room was lit by flickering candles. In the center of the room stood the woman, her eyes glowing red in the dim light. She smiled at them, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. The teenagers stepped back, but they knew that they had to face her if they wanted to stop the evil. They held up their holy water and crucifixes, and the woman screeched in rage. The room shook, and the symbols on the walls began to glow. The teenagers held on tight, and they could feel the power of the evil pressing down on them. But they didn't give up. They continued to chant, and the woman began to fade away, shrieking in agony. The symbols on the walls vanished, and the room returned to its original state. The teenagers breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that they had defeated the evil. They left the mansion and never returned, and the town slowly returned to normal. The locals whispered that the evil had been vanquished, but they never forgot the horror that had taken hold of their town. The mansion remained empty, a silent reminder of the terror that had once plagued Millfield. Years later, people still talk about the events of that stormy night. Some say that the evil still lurks within the mansion, waiting for its next victim. Others say that the teenagers saved the town from a fate worse than death. But one thing is certain, nobody will ever forget the terror that came to Millfield that night. As the sun began to set, I found myself lost in the deep, dark forest. My heart was pounding as I stumbled over roots and through thick brush, trying to find my way back to civilization. The trees towered above me, casting ominous shadows on the ground, and the silence was deafening. I had never felt so alone and vulnerable in my life. Suddenly I heard a rustling behind me, and my heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me, telling myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the feeling persisted, and my nerves were on edge. As I walked deeper into the forest, the trees grew thicker and the darkness deeper. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees, and I quickened my pace. I tried to stay calm and focused, but the rustling sounds behind me only grew louder and more frequent. Then I heard it, a faint whisper that sent shivers down my spine. I turned around, but there was still no one there. The whispering grew louder, and I realized that it was coming from all around me. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy and slow, as though they were weighed down by some unseen force. Suddenly I saw a figure emerge from the darkness, a pale, ghostly figure that glowed in the moonlight. It was a woman, with long, tangled hair and a tattered dress that flapped in the wind. She had a mournful expression on her face, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. I tried to run, but she floated towards me, her ghostly hands reaching out to me. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew that I was in grave danger. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The ghostly figure spoke to me in a whispery voice, telling me of her tragic past and how she had died in the forest many years ago. Her story was haunting and sad, and I felt a deep sense of sorrow for her. But at the same time, I knew that I had to get away from her, or I would suffer the same fate. I stumbled backwards, tripping over a fallen branch, and fell to the ground. The ghostly figure floated towards me, her eyes glowing with a sinister light. I knew that I was trapped, and that there was no way out. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I screamed in terror. I turned to see another ghostly figure standing behind me. This one a man, with a twisted, sinister expression on his face. He reached out to me with his ghostly hands, and I knew that he meant me harm. I tried to crawl away, but my limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. I knew that I was going to die, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The ghosts closed in on me, their ghostly hands reaching out to grab me. Just when I thought that all was lost, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. The ghosts turned towards the sound, and I saw a figure emerge from the darkness. It was a man, with a fierce expression on his face, and he held a flashlight in his hand. The man shouted at the ghosts, and they recoiled in fear. He grabbed me by the hand and pulled me to my feet, and we ran towards the safety of the outside world. As we emerged from the forest, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I turned to thank the man who had saved my life, but he was gone. I looked around, but there was no sign of him. I was alone, but I was safe. As I made my way back to civilization, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that still lingered within me. The ghostly figures, their haunted whispers, and the deep, dark forest haunted my thoughts. I knew that I had experienced something otherworldly and terrifying, and I couldn't explain it. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about my experience in the forest. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that there was a logical explanation for everything that had happened. But deep down, I knew that there was something more to it, something that defied explanation. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, with a feeling of dread settling over me. As I lay in bed, I heard a faint whispering sound, and I knew that the ghosts from the forest had returned. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination, but the whispering grew louder and more persistent. Suddenly I felt a cold breeze blow through my room, and I knew that I was not alone. I turned on my bedside lamp, but the light flickered and died, leaving me in darkness. Then I saw them, the ghostly figures from the forest, standing at the foot of my bed. Their eyes glowed with a sinister light, and their ghostly hands reached out to me. I screamed in terror, but there was no one to hear me. Emily had just moved into her new apartment and was excited to start her life in the city. She had always dreamed of living in a big city and finally had the opportunity to make that dream a reality. However, her excitement quickly turned to fear when she realized that she was being followed. At first, it was just a feeling she had, but soon enough she began to notice the same person lurking around her apartment building and following her wherever she went. Emily tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but the presence of her stalker only grew more persistent. She could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move. One night she came home from work and noticed that her apartment door was open. Her heart raced as she realized that someone had broken in. She called the police, but they couldn't find any evidence of a break-in. From that night on, Emily began to notice strange things happening in her apartment. Objects would be moved or misplaced, and she would hear strange noises at night. She knew that her stalker was getting bolder and more dangerous. One night, Emily woke up to find her stalker standing at the foot of her bed. She screamed, but he quickly covered her mouth, warning her not to make a sound. He told her that he had been watching her for weeks and that he knew everything about her. Emily's fear turned to anger. She refused to let this man control her. She told him that she was going to call the police, but he just laughed and told her that they wouldn't be able to find him. Emily knew she had to take matters into her own hands. She began to research self-defense techniques and installed a security system in her apartment. She also started to carry pepper spray with her everywhere she went. But no matter how much she tried to protect herself, her stalker was always one step ahead. He continued to follow her, watching her every move. One day, Emily was walking home from work when she noticed that she was being followed. She quickened her pace, hoping to lose her stalker, but he was too fast. He grabbed her from behind, covering her mouth with his hand. Emily struggled against him, but he was too strong. He dragged her into an alleyway, away from the busy street. Emily was terrified. She knew that she had to do something before it was too late. She took a deep breath and kicked him as hard as she could. He stumbled back, giving her enough time to run away. Emily sprinted down the street, not stopping until she reached the police station. She told them everything that had happened, and they were able to track down her stalker. He was arrested and charged with stalking and attempted kidnapping. Months passed, and Emily slowly began to feel like she was getting her life back on track. She had moved to a new apartment, installed an even more sophisticated security system, and had taken up self-defense classes. But one night, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard a noise outside her apartment. At first she dismissed it as her imagination, but then she heard the sound again. It was the same sound she had heard the night her stalker had broken into her old apartment. Emily's heart raced as she realized that her worst nightmare had returned. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but as she waited for the operator to answer, she heard a knock on her door. It was the stalker. He had found her again. Emily tried to remain calm and composed, but she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this time, he wouldn't just let her go. The stalker banged on the door, demanding that Emily open it. She backed away slowly, trying to put as much distance between herself and the door as possible. But she knew that it was only a matter of time before he broke in. Suddenly the door burst open, and the stalker charged towards her. Emily screamed and ran towards the kitchen, hoping to find something to defend herself with. But the stalker was too fast. He caught up to her and grabbed her by the hair, pulling her towards him. Emily fought back, but it was no use. The stalker was too strong. He lifted her up and slammed her against the wall, knocking the breath out of her. She slumped to the floor, gasping for air, as the stalker loomed over her. She knew that this was the end. The stalker leaned down, his face inches from hers, and whispered, "You thought you could get away from me, but you can't. I'll always be watching you." Emily closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. She felt the stalker's hands tighten around her neck, cutting off her air supply. She gasped and struggled, but it was no use. As Emily's vision began to fade, she realized that she had made a fatal mistake. She had let her guard down, thinking that she was safe. But the stalker had been watching her all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Now, it was too late. Emily had fallen victim to her stalker's twisted obsession, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. As Emily took her last breath, the stalker smiled, knowing that he had finally claimed his prize. He had succeeded in breaking her spirit and taking her life. And as he walked away, disappearing into the night, he knew that he would continue to haunt Emily, even in death, for the memory of her terror would be his ultimate reward. The rain was coming down in sheets, pounding against the windows like 1,000 tiny fists. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters and shaking the very foundation of the house. Alice sat huddled in front of the fire, the only source of warmth in the cold, dark night. She had been on her way home when the storm hit, and had barely made it to the abandoned cabin in time. As she sat there, listening to the storm rage outside, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The cabin was isolated and remote, and there was no one around for miles. She was alone, completely at the mercy of the storm. Suddenly there was a loud bang, and the lights flickered before going out completely. Alice gasped in terror, her heart racing as she was plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, she heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere outside. Alice tried to remain calm, telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But then, there was a soft tapping at the window, like something was trying to get in. She crept towards the window, her heart racing with fear. She slowly pulled back the curtain, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Standing in the darkness was a figure, shrouded in a long black cloak. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its face was twisted into a grotesque sneer. Alice tried to back away, but her foot caught on a loose floorboard and she stumbled. The figure was upon her in an instant, its bony hands wrapping around her throat. She fought desperately, clawing at the figure with her fingernails, but it was no use. The figure was too strong and its grip was like iron. As Alice felt herself slipping away, she saw the figure's face for the first time. It was like something out of a nightmare, twisted and evil, its eyes glowing with a demonic light. And then there was darkness, a deep, impenetrable darkness that swallowed her whole. When the storm had finally passed and the authorities arrived, they found the cabin empty. There was no sign of Alice, no trace of her ever having been there. As they searched the surrounding woods, they found nothing but twisted, gnarled trees and a deep sense of unease. The storm had passed, but the darkness remained, like a physical presence in the air. Years later, people still talk about the cabin and the stormy night when Alice disappeared. Some say that she was taken by the figure in the cloak, others that she simply got lost in the woods. But there are those who believe that something far more sinister happened that night, that the darkness that surrounded the cabin was not just a storm, but something far more ancient and malevolent. They say that the darkness still lurks in the woods, waiting for its next victim to come wandering by. And they warn anyone who dares to venture into those woods on a stormy night to be careful, for the darkness is always watching, always waiting. The old factory stood like a hulking giant in the middle of town. Once a thriving hub of industry, it now lay abandoned and forgotten. The air was thick with the stench of rust and decay, and the silence was broken only by the sound of metal creaking in the wind. For years the factory had stood empty, its once bustling halls now silent and lifeless. But one day, a group of urban explorers stumbled upon the factory, eager to explore its decaying interiors. The group consisted of 5 friends, all of them adrenaline junkies looking for their next thrill. They entered the factory through a broken window, their flashlights illuminating the darkened hallways. As they explored the factory, they found nothing of interest. The old machinery had been removed, and there was nothing left inside but rusted metal and crumbling concrete. But then, they stumbled upon a hidden staircase leading down into the bowels of the factory. It was a staircase that looked like it had not been used in decades, and the group hesitated before descending into the darkness. The staircase seemed to go on forever, each step taking them deeper into the belly of the factory. The air grew colder and the darkness more oppressive, and the group began to feel a sense of unease. And then, they heard it. A sound like grinding metal, coming from deep within the factory. It was a sound that made their skin crawl, a sound that seemed to be alive with a malevolent energy. The group hesitated, but curiosity got the better of them, and they continued down the staircase. As they descended, the sound grew louder and more insistent, until it was almost unbearable. Finally, they reached the bottom of the staircase, and they found themselves in a vast underground chamber. The air was thick with dust, and the sound of metal grinding against metal filled their ears. And then, they saw it. A figure shrouded in darkness appeared in the distance, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. It was a being of darkness, a creature that seemed to be made of shadows and smoke. The group tried to run, but the creature was too fast. It moved with an otherworldly grace, its long limbs propelling it forward with incredible speed. One by one, the friends fell, consumed by the darkness that surrounded them. The creature seemed invincible, unstoppable, as if it were immune to any harm that they could inflict. As the last of the friends fell, consumed by the darkness, the creature disappeared back into the shadows. The factory fell silent once more, the only sound the sound of metal creaking in the wind. Days later, the police were called to investigate the disappearance of the group of friends. They searched the factory but found nothing. It was as if the factory had swallowed the friends whole, leaving no trace behind. The factory still stands, a dark and ominous presence in the town. Few dare to enter its doors, for they know that the darkness that surrounds it is hungry for souls. Beware the old factory, for it is a place of terror and death. But there are those who believe that something far more sinister happened that night, that the darkness that surrounded the cabin was not just a storm, but something far more ancient and malevolent. They say that the darkness still lurks in the woods, waiting for its next victim to come wandering by. And they warn anyone who dares to venture into those woods on a stormy night to be careful, for the darkness is always watching, always waiting. Deep in the heart of the forest, there was a small hut that stood alone, hidden from the rest of the world. The hut was old and weathered, its thatched roof sagging under the weight of the years. It was said that the hut was cursed, that anyone who dared to enter its doors would never return. But one night, a group of travellers stumbled upon the hut, seeking shelter from the cold and the rain. They were weary and tired, and the hut seemed like the perfect place to rest for the night. As they entered the hut, they could feel a sense of unease creeping over them. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay, and the only light came from a flickering candle that cast eerie shadows across the walls. The travellers settled in for the night, but they could not shake the feeling that something was watching them. They could hear strange noises coming from the darkness outside, and they could feel the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end. And then they heard a sound, a faint scratching noise coming from the walls. They tried to ignore it, telling themselves that it was just the wind, but the scratching grew louder and more insistent, until it was impossible to ignore. Suddenly the walls began to shake, and the air was filled with a deafening roar. The travellers huddled together, trying to shield themselves from whatever was outside, but it was no use. The hut was being torn apart, ripped to shreds by some unseen force. The travellers tried to run, but they found themselves trapped, unable to escape the hut that had become their prison. They could hear the sound of their own screams echoing through the darkness, but they could do nothing to save themselves. As the hut collapsed around them, the travellers caught a glimpse of the creature that had been unleashed upon them. It was a being of darkness, a being that seemed to be made of shadows and smoke. Its eyes glowed with an unholy light, and its skin was cold and clammy to the touch. The travellers tried to fight, but they found that their weapons had no effect on the creature. It seemed invincible, unstoppable, as if it were immune to any harm that they could inflict. And then, one by one, the travellers began to disappear, consumed by the darkness that surrounded them. They could hear the sound of their screams echoing through the forest, but they could do nothing to save them. As the last traveller fell, consumed by the darkness, the creature turned its attention to the outside world. It emerged from the hut, its eyes still glowing with an unholy light, and it began to roam the forest, seeking out new victims. The locals knew that something was wrong, that there was a darkness that had been unleashed upon their land. They tried to warn the outsiders, to tell them to stay away from the hut, but it was too late. The creature had already claimed its victims, and it was hungry for more. And so the creature roamed the forest, seeking out new victims, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. It was a creature of darkness, a being that had been unleashed upon the world, and it would not rest until it had consumed all that it could. The hut still stands, a testament to the darkness that lies hidden in the heart of the forest. Few dare to enter its doors, and those that do never return. For the hut is cursed, and the darkness that surrounds it is hungry for souls. Beware the hut in the forest, for it is a place of darkness and despair, a place where the shadows reign supreme. In the heart of Thailand, nestled among the lush green jungles and ancient temples, there was a village known for its vibrant night market. The stalls were filled with colourful lanterns, exotic spices, and trinkets of all kinds. But the locals knew that there was something sinister lurking beneath the surface. One night, a group of tourists arrived at the night market. They were excited to try the street food and take in the sights and sounds of the bustling market. As they wandered through the stalls, they noticed a woman selling strange talismans and amulets. The woman had piercing eyes and a sinister smile, and she seemed to be watching them as they made their way through the market. One of the tourists, a young woman named Samantha, felt a strange pull towards the woman's stall. She couldn't explain why, but she felt drawn to the amulets on display. Samantha approached the woman, who greeted her with a toothy grin. She showed Samantha a small amulet, intricately carved with ancient symbols. The woman told Samantha that the amulet would bring her good fortune and protect her from harm. Samantha was skeptical, but something about the woman's words resonated with her. She purchased the amulet and put it around her neck. She felt a strange warmth spreading through her body, and she knew that she had made the right choice. The group of tourists continued to explore the night market, but as the night wore on, they began to notice that something was off. The once bustling market had grown eerily quiet, and the stalls were beginning to pack up and leave. As they made their way towards the exit, they saw the woman from the talisman stall again. This time she was surrounded by a group of locals, all dressed in black robes. The tourists tried to avoid them, but they were surrounded. The woman approached Samantha, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Samantha felt a chill run down her spine, and she knew that something was terribly wrong. The woman spoke in a language that Samantha didn't understand, and she could see the fear in the other tourists' eyes. Suddenly the woman's eyes turned pitch black, and she let out a blood-curdling scream. The other locals began to chant, their voices rising in a macabre melody. Samantha felt her amulet grow hot against her skin, and she knew that she had to get out of there. She broke free from the group and ran towards the exit. But as she ran, she could hear the screams of the other tourists growing fainter and fainter. She knew that she had to keep running, or she would be caught by whatever had taken hold of the night market. As she ran, she could feel something chasing her, something dark and malevolent. She could hear the whispering voices of the locals, calling out to her in a language she didn't understand. The darkness was closing in, and Samantha knew that she was running out of time. Just as she thought that she would be caught, she saw a small temple in the distance. She ran towards it, hoping that she could find safety within its walls. As she approached the temple, she could see that it was old and weathered, but it offered sanctuary from the darkness that was chasing her. She pushed open the doors and stumbled inside, gasping for breath. She could hear the sounds of the night market outside, but the darkness couldn't penetrate the temple's walls. She collapsed onto the ground, her heart pounding in her chest. But her relief was short-lived. As she sat there, she could hear something moving in the shadows. She tried to get up and run, but she found that she was frozen in place. As Samantha struggled to move, she realized that something had a hold of her, something that she couldn't see. She felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, and she could hear the faint whispers of the locals growing louder. She closed her eyes and tried to will herself to move, to break free from whatever was holding her down. But as she struggled, she could feel her strength ebbing away. She was trapped, helpless, and alone in the darkness. Suddenly she felt a sharp pain in her neck, and she cried out in agony. She felt something warm and wet trickling down her skin, and she knew that she was bleeding. She tried to scream for help, but her voice was muffled by something covering her mouth. As she lay there, struggling to breathe, she felt a cold presence moving closer to her. She could feel its breath on her skin, and she knew that it was coming for her. She tried to move, to fight back, but she was too weak. She knew that this was the end. But then she felt a surge of energy, and she realized that her amulet was glowing. The warmth spread through her body, and she felt a surge of strength. With all her might, she pushed back against the darkness, willing herself to break free. But then, she felt a surge of energy, and she realized that her amulet was glowing. The warmth spread through her body, and she felt a surge of strength. With all her might, she pushed back against the darkness, willing herself to break free. And suddenly, she was standing, free from whatever had been holding her down. The darkness receded, and she could see the temple's walls glowing with a soft golden light. She knew that she had been saved by the power of her amulet, but the danger was not yet over. She could still hear the whispers of the locals outside, and she knew that they would not give up so easily. She stood up, ready to fight, and she felt the power of the amulet flowing through her. As she stepped out of the temple, she could see the locals waiting for her, their eyes gleaming with malice. But she was not afraid. She raised her hand and a burst of energy shot out, knocking the locals back. She felt the power of the amulet flowing through her, and she knew that she was invincible. She fought back against the darkness, and she could feel it receding with each blow. The locals retreated, and she knew that she had won. As she stood there, catching her breath, she realized that she had been changed by the experience. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, and she knew that she would never be the same again. From that day forward, Samantha wore her amulet with pride, knowing that it had saved her from the darkness. She had learned that sometimes the things that we cannot see are the most dangerous, and that we must always be vigilant against the forces of evil. As she left the night market, She knew that she had a newfound respect for the power of the unknown, and that she would never forget the terror of that fateful night in the heart of Thailand. The old lighthouse sat perched on the rocky coastline, its walls battered by years of wind and sea. It had been abandoned for years, the beacon that once guided ships to safety now nothing more than a relic of a bygone era. But one stormy night, a small group of friends decided to explore the old lighthouse, intrigued by the mystery and history that surrounded it. They huddled together in the dark, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls as they climbed the narrow staircase. As they climbed higher and higher, the wind grew stronger, howling through the cracks in the walls and rattling the rusted metal beams. The air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding settled over the group. Finally, they reached the top of the lighthouse, the beam room where the light once shone out to sea. But what they found there was something they could never have expected. In the center of the room was a small wooden chest, its lid thrown open as if it had been waiting for them. The group gathered around it, their curiosity piqued. Inside the chest, they found a bundle of old papers, yellowed with age and covered in faded writing. The papers told the story of the lighthouse keeper, a man named William, who had lived and worked in the lighthouse for many years. But as they read on, they realized that something was wrong. The papers spoke of strange occurrences and unexplainable events, of whispers in the dark and shadows that moved on their own. As they read on, the storm outside grew worse, the wind howling like a chorus of demons, and then, suddenly, the door to the beam room slammed shut, trapping them inside. They tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge, and then they heard it, a soft whispering sound, like someone speaking in a language they couldn't understand. The whispering grew louder, and soon it was joined by the sound of shuffling feet, as if something was moving towards them in the darkness. Panic set in, and the group began to scream, their flashlights flickering wildly as they tried to find a way out. But the whispering grew louder and louder, until it was all they could hear. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The room fell silent, and the group was left standing in the darkness, their hearts pounding with fear. They didn't know how long they stood there, waiting for something to happen. But eventually, the door creaked open, and they stumbled out into the night air. As they fled the lighthouse, they could feel something watching them, following them through the darkness. And even as they reached the safety of their car, they knew that they were not alone. For in that old lighthouse, something had been awoken, something ancient and malevolent that had been lying dormant for centuries. And now it was hungry. In the days that followed, the group tried to forget what had happened in the lighthouse, but the memory stayed with them, haunting their dreams and filling them with a deep sense of dread. And as they looked out to sea, they could see the lighthouse, its beacon now extinguished, standing as a silent testament to the horrors that lay within.